Hi guys, and welcome back to the UK's Human Landscape. If you haven't yet subscribed, please do so down below. We are moving today on to inquiry question 2, which is looking at how one major UK city has changed. We're going to look at how it changes in a variety of different ways. Different schools around the country can choose different case studies, but we are choosing London. One, because we're already living here, and so our knowledge of the areas that we live in and the city that we live in is hopefully going to be valuable to us. 2, because it links easily with our human fieldwork, in which case we are going to visit one of the areas we're going to look at. As we look at London in detail over the next couple of lessons, we're going to look at everything from inequality, decline in London's past, rejuvenation, and the challenges and opportunities that London faces as it moves forward into the future. Today, we're going to start off with a broad overview of London, looking at its site and situation, and then its population and how migration has had a huge impact on it. So, just to start us off, can you make me a list, please, of all the facts that you know about London? Think about why it's considered an important place. What is it that we value about it? Why is it important? Why are we talking about it? Why have we chosen it as our case study? Okay, and if you can, please, 3 key terms linked to migration. If you can define the ones that are on that worksheet for me, that would be fantastic. If you don't know those ones, but you know some others, that is also fantastic. So, pause the video, get your worksheet open, and do the starter, please. Okay, so let's have a look at some answers then. Hopefully you know that London is the capital city of the UK, and coming with that capital city makes it the largest city in the UK. It has more than 8 million people, and that number rises over 10 million people each day with the number of people that commute from the surrounding rural areas or the surrounding towns to work. It's also our centre of government. We have our Houses of Parliament here. It's where a lot of the decision making is taking place. And with that centre of government then comes a centre of power almost. And that power matters because money and power, they have some pretty strong links, don't they? So it's not just about it being the capital, it's the political centre, the economic centre in some ways of the UK. We have high diversity, and hopefully you know that, you experience that in your communities. Perhaps it's something that we see represented in the media or on TV, we hope. We have high migration, okay? There's lots of people who come from all over the country and all over the world who come to London, whether that's to study, to work, to be reunited with families, for opportunities, whatever reasons they are, and we're going to explore some of those today. There are lots of jobs available, so there's a high employment rate in London. We have some major universities, perhaps you've heard of UCL, Imperial, LSE or King's, amongst many other universities. There's, unfortunately, huge inequality. Some super rich people and some of the poorest people in the whole of the UK live in London side by side. And that juxtaposition makes it an interesting place to look at geographically. And we also, as we've mentioned in previous lessons, have high foreign direct investment. We talked about the Shard, we talked about the Emirates Stadium, we talked about a lot of the companies that are buying property or, companies that are based in London. So there's high foreign direct investment in London. And there is a large financial or banking sector, okay? Historically large, quite important, particularly in the European centres, Perhaps it won't be in the future, but for now, that banking centre, that financial centre is still really significant in the UK. Let's have a look at those 3 key terms I asked you to define then. So our challenge was to define those 3 key terms. An economic migrant is someone who moves to live and work somewhere else to improve their standard of living. Our standard of living is a few things, but it has a large component of income, okay? So moving to improve perhaps their income, the opportunities they have in terms of the work they do, the quality of their life in terms of the material possessions that they have. Emigration is one that people often forget. We, of course, lose many people, thousands of people from the UK every year, migrating away from the UK, maybe sometimes for sunnier places or places with more job opportunities or different opportunities. Remittances is a key economic and migration term that I would love you all to be able to use in your exams. It's super, super relevant when we're talking about migrants, because migrants have benefits both to their source country and their host country. And in this case, remittances are the money that migrants send back to their source country. They send money home, and that improves quality of life in those places. But it also has an impact here because it takes money away from this area, okay? And that can be quite significant. For example, India receives over $73 billion worth of remittances from its global community. And there's one more key term there that I haven't put on the sheet, but if you knew it, it would be fantastic. The global community of people from one particular country, say for example, Indians living here in Dubai, in America, in Australia, anywhere in the world, that global community of people who are Indian but not living in India are called the diaspora. Okay, and that's a word that we can always use when we're discussing migration. And of course, London is the home to many, many diasporas, people from all over the world. In fact, it has some of the largest diasporas outside of those individual countries. So let's have a look then at London's site. When we talk about a site, and I've put this definition on your worksheet, we're saying what is the actual location of the place that we're talking about, okay? What is this location of this settlement, and what are the physical characteristics of the landscape specific to the area? So we're going to start at a global scale, as big as we can get pretty much, okay? And we're going to say, at a global context, London is in the United Kingdom, it's in the Northern Hemisphere, it's in the northwest of Europe, okay? It sits on the Atlantic Ocean and also the English Channel and the North Sea. And these are significant at a regional and global level, particularly for trade purposes. A map of the elevation in the UK. It's a very simplified one, but I just want you to remind yourselves of where we find upland and lowland areas that have high elevation or altitude and areas that have low elevation or altitude. And it gives you an interesting comparison, of course, to say that Scotland, with its largely high altitude areas, has very low population density, as we see in this map here on the right. The southeast of England, which we've discussed in terms of its economic divide, is partly divided in that way because it has a large population down here in the southeast, and that's in part as a result of the large, wide, flat plains, which are ideal for farming and building towns and cities, whereas somewhere with highlands like Wales, for instance, has a very low population density. If we look at London's site then in terms of its place in England, we need to remind ourselves that it is in the southeast of England, and it sits, of course, on the River Thames and quite close to the Thames estuary, which is where the Thames flows into the North Sea. And that has a real impact on some of the characteristics and even the risks that London faces. So its site is really important. If we look more closely at London's site within the southeast of England, we've discussed the River Thames already. We might suggest that it is also very close to the coast with the English Channel, quite close to the coast. Think about why it matters that we're close to the coast, that we're on a river, particularly in the past. Why has that been so important? Now, when we talk about the significance of a location, not just describing where it is as we did here, but talking about why it matters, we're talking about the situation. We're saying this is the location of a place relative to its other surroundings and other places. And then we can discuss why its site and situation is ideal. So if we're talking about London again, it's located within the UK, which is of course in the northwest of Europe. And it's got quite a close proximity to France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In terms of its situation in relation to other places within the UK, There are lots and lots of surrounding towns and cities, say for instance Reading, Canterbury, Brighton. Okay, and actually if we were to look at satellite image, we would suggest that London is part of a conurbation, a large urban area that sprawls well beyond its technical boundaries, which might be the London boroughs, for instance. And if we look here at this detailed map of London specifically, we notice the way that it has grown. It has grown outwards from a centre. If this is where old original London was, many of the places that are now known as part of London used to be their own separate towns. Okay, so if we were to look, for instance, at Barnet or Hendon, Camden or Tottenham, these were separate towns before London sort of engulfed them or overtook them and merged into one major city. We see it more clearly on this map, perhaps looking at Greenwich, Wandsworth, Hampstead. And these are places that we might say, oh, you know, there's like a Hampstead village within the major city of London. How can we possibly have an area that is known as Hampstead Village within a city? But that's because it was at one point a separate city. So on your worksheet, I want you, having heard that explanation, having seen these maps, to describe the site and situation. You have the definitions of what they are. The difference between them is that the site is the physical aspects of where is London physically. What physical features do we find there? What is the land like, perhaps? What we say the land in the southeast was like. And the situation is relative to other places, relative to the rest of Europe, relative to other cities, relative to the coast. Where is it? Okay? And if you can, what benefits does that site have? Why does it matter that it's on a river? Why has that been so important in London's history and past? Pause the video for me. Get on with that worksheet, please. Then, in terms of London's site, you should have already picked up on the fact that we are in the southeast of the UK. We're near to the English Channel, which separates England from France. The city sits in the Thames Valley. I've mentioned the River Thames. You should know that a valley is formed by a river, and particularly because we're in the lower course of the River Thames, it's a large, wide, flat valley, and the river runs straight through the middle of it. Of course, that should be pinging off in your head a whole host of issues that could come with sitting in the lower course of a river, particularly flooding. Okay, so the east of London is very close to the Thames estuary. Okay, if we consider that the M25, which is this lovely ring road that surrounds London, which I'm sure many, many people hate, it is actually very, very close to the Thames estuary. And if you think, you know, a little clue on why it's been so important to have a river through London, think about one of London's most iconic landmarks, Tower Bridge. Why is Tower Bridge so interesting? What does it do that's weird, maybe, or unusual? Yeah, it lifts up. Why does it lift up? Why does it need to do that? It needs to lift up because we're allowing shipping to pass through. You're allowing boats with taller masts to be able to pass through the river without having to be small enough to go under the bridge or crashing into it. Okay, and that was super important because, of course, London's location on the river meant that it was ideally placed for trade. And that is still the case. Okay, we don't get big ships coming into the centre of London anymore, but we still get them coming up the estuary, and they tend to stop just outside of London itself, near to Dartford, in an area called Gravesend. So, something I didn't mention before was the time zone, but I would like you please to add it to your notes. London's time zone is based on its location in the world. And I'm just going to go back a little bit so that we're looking here. Just remind me, where does the sun rise? It rises in the east, okay, because the earth is turning in this direction. Okay, so the sun appears to rise in the east. The earliest places to get a new day are in the east of the world, okay? Places like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, And if you've ever sat around on New Year's Day or New Year's Eve waiting for New Year's, the first people to get their fireworks to go off are, of course, places like this, okay? So the day sort of starts here and then it travels across the world this direction. Now, what that means is when the sun is rising in the UK, as the day starts in the UK, the morning starts in the UK, it is the afternoon or the early evening in Asia. Which means that if you were working in the morning in the United Kingdom, in London, you could talk to the people in Asia. You could operate on the same time scale as them, roughly. And then, as the day continues, by the time we get to the UK's afternoon and evening, it's starting to be morning in the Americas. And this is quite important. It might sound like it doesn't matter, but the United Kingdom's position, sort of somewhere here in the middle, means that any business, any transnational company, as we've been talking about over the past couple of lessons, can operate not just by email, but actually in some ways, over a video conference or a phone call with places a very, very long way away without too much difficulty. On the other hand, if you were based in New York and you wanted to speak to someone in Asia, you're operating on almost the same time difference of 12 hours that we would be if we wanted to talk to people in Australia. Yeah? And that can be very, very difficult. But in this case, we're saying for London, as its global financial centre, that is a really valuable thing in terms of its location. So let's go back to our answers. So the time zone is ahead of Asia to the east and behind the Americas to the west. Okay, there's a little bit of a challenging concept to get your head around, I know, but if you can do that, for those of you that are aiming for 9s, and there are lots of you in my class, let's go for that, please. Okay, so its situation relative to other things. London's position on the river and close to the channel has made it a port city. If you haven't got the phrase port city in your answer, put it in, please. It's ideally located for trade with Europe and the rest of the world. In recent years, close proximity to Europe has made it an ideal hub for global trade. What other factor has made the UK close to Europe? It should, of course, go off in your mind that we have been members of the European Union for a very long time now. Although that may not continue to be the case, okay, it has been hugely beneficial to London. The time zone, as I've just mentioned to you, allows for cooperation with Asia in the morning and the Americas in the afternoon. Okay, so pause the video, go back and green pen your answers, add some detail to them if you're missing something for me, please. And we're going to move on. So, if London's site and situation are what they are, what we've just discussed, we want to think about how is that connected to other places. So London is connected regionally within its sort of area surrounding it, nationally to places across the whole country, and internationally. But just on this slide, we're talking about regionally and nationally. So on your worksheet, once we finish talking through this, you are going to put down 3 ways, please, that London is connected nationally and regionally. And let's have a look at what sources we've got. So on a national scale, London is connected in a weird way. You can see it's almost a hub. It's like every road across the country pretty much leads back to London. And this can be an issue in some ways, right? These are our motorways and A roads, major A roads. It can be an issue for some places that perhaps there aren't, huge motorways that connect these two areas. And that lack of connectivity means that things tend to focus back in on London. So our road network, okay, is one that we would describe as radial. Okay, radial means that they radiate out like the sun's rays from the centre of London. It's a radial structure, okay? Our train lines look similar to this. I haven't put it on here, but our train lines are pretty similar. Many, many, many train lines across the country end up back in London. So train networks, road networks, okay? Down here is quite a famous map. It's the London Tube map. It's not a very geographically accurate map, but it is a very useful one, okay? And it relies much more on meaning and relationship between places, not physically, but through the connections that the map shows. And this map shows us a bit more about how London is connected regionally, So within its region, within London, how is London connected? And what I'm tracing down here, this sort of light blue line down here, this is the River Thames. Do you notice anything between one half of the map and the other half of the map? I should hope that you've noticed that south of the River Thames, there is nowhere near as big a tube network. Now, that doesn't mean there are no connections. There are connections, but they aren't necessarily underground. Many of those connections are actually just overground railways, okay? So one more major connection for you. We've already talked about road, we've talked about rail. Now we're going to talk about transnational corporations, okay? London has become a place where transnational corporations prefer to locate. So if you've got big companies that operate internationally basing themselves in London, it leads other businesses that might provide services to them to also locate there. So let's talk about the financial sector as an example. The finance sector is based in London. Great. But who else does that impact? Well, that affects people that are going to provide perhaps cleaning services. A lot of cleaning services are then going to be able to clean the offices of those finance firms. The tech services, the internet provision, the computing know-how, the coders, they've all got to be based in London if they're going to support those financial centres. And the marketing and advertising has to also be based somewhere nearby. So what happens is you get a concentration of businesses. And in fact, 90% of all business services in the UK are located either in London or in the southeast of England. Okay, so when we talked about the north-south divide before, we said that on average, the southeast is wealthier. Part of the reason is that in the southeast of England, in this area here, 90% of all of the business services in the UK are located there. Okay, which means that, of course, when we talk about employment opportunities, if 90% of business services are here and you want to work in tertiary industries, you don't want to work in primary extraction industries, you don't want to work in manufacturing, perhaps you went to university and you got, a very high level of education and you want to work in a tertiary sector, you kind of don't have a choice but to live and work in this area, or at least if you want lots of opportunities. Those opportunities are going to be found where 90% of our businesses are. So that might be your third point. Pause the video. National and regional connections, please, on your worksheet. Go. So let's look at London's international connections. Take a moment and just think for me. We've already mentioned quite a few international connections. What ones have we mentioned already? We may have mentioned migration. We may have mentioned transnational companies. We may have mentioned trade, okay? These are things that are going to be really important. Even when we were talking about the European Union, that's an international connection, okay? So what are some of those ways then? The global financial market, I hope you remember, okay? So international accessibility. Firstly, to be connected to the rest of the world, we have in recent years relied heavily on flights. Now, the planes may be grounded at the moment because of the coronavirus scare, and that may be putting a lot of pressure on the airline industry, but London has one of the 5 largest and busiest international airports in Europe, some of the largest. Heathrow itself has 5 separate terminals, okay? And London has 5 airports. It also has a rail link, a train link that goes underneath the English Channel, which is called Eurostar, and that goes to France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Transnational corporations, we've discussed this a little bit already. So this second box here, you've already got about 90% of all businesses services in the UK are located in the southeast. The bit that you haven't got necessarily is that out of 500 transnational companies in the UK, 54% of them are based in London. Okay, and a further 28% are located along the M4 corridor. If you want to know where the M4 corridor is, I'll show it to you. Look at this motorway map here. So this motorway that stretches out west, the M4, has a huge number of major businesses based on it. Thirdly, our world network of financial centres. Okay, when we talk about a financial centre, if you can imagine all those stocks and share prices, very digital financial services, but also things like insurance, things like accounting. Yeah, just doing the accounts for a business that exists, as well as trading, almost guessing, as it were, based on the stock market. So the World Network of Financial Centres, if you wanted to know where some of the other major financial centres are, we've said that London is one of them. If we want to think about how they're connected, another major financial centre is New York. Okay, so Wall Street in New York is the very famous area that houses the financial centre there. And as we've mentioned, the time zone that London's in allows us to trade on the New York Stock Exchange, if we so wish. And in the East, in Asia, another major financial centre is in Tokyo, over here in Japan. Okay, and many, many global banks have headquarters in those places. Okay, finally then, the market. Now, when I use the phrase the market, it is similar to a literal like market where you'd go buy fruit and vegetables. Okay, when we say a market, we're saying a place where people are able to buy and sell things. And London is one of the largest and most affluent. When we say this word affluent, we mean wealthy. So one of the largest and most wealthy markets in the UK because of how much people earn on average and the number of businesses. Okay, you've got to think that a market is not just for the clothes that we buy or the foods that we buy. In terms of all the things that London might buy and sell in a day, it can range from services, it can range from goods, it could be chemicals or steel, it can be energy, it can be information, it could be all kinds of things that you can buy and sell. And because London has all of those businesses, has a very wealthy population, it's a very, very big market for companies to be able to sell their products, services, and the rest. And so, of course, top international retailers have locations in London to be able to take advantage of that market. All those people willing to buy stuff. On your worksheet, please, go back. 4 ways London is connected internationally under your world map. You do not need to copy all of this. Put it in your own words. Yeah? Say transport connections include major international airports. Say things like transnational companies. 54% of transnational companies in the UK are based in London. Population has changed. I have a nice simple line graph here of how London's population has changed. Overall then, we are going to describe this graph and we're going to use data as we do it. We're going to describe the general trend and then make some notes of details. Now, when we're describing graphs like this, we want to say what we see overall. We want to use some evidence. Okay, and we might want to point out any significant things. Okay, so just looking at that, what has already been pointed out to us? Well, we've got these 2 bars that indicate the world wars. We've got a little bit of future data, okay, and we've got, of course, an overall trend. Hopefully now you've spotted that generally, over time, yeah, we're going back a couple 100 years here, London's population has simply grown right up until, it seems, World War II, in which case it started to decline and then it started to grow again in the 1990s. Okay, so when you're writing your answer, I want you to please use the mnemonic T. Okay, let's have the T on this graph. T stands for trend, E stands for example or evidence. That means an actual number, please. And then an anomaly or outlier, something that doesn't fit the trend. We already mentioned what that is. Okay, over here, big hint. And the challenge, please, can you give me reasons why this has happened? Do you know why this might have happened in particular? Okay, pause the video, write an answer. I'll give you an answer in just a moment. So let's have a look at a model answer. Your answer may be as detailed as this, it may not be. You may not have attempted the challenge. Either way, I'd like you to make sure you correct your answer, improve it please, either by adding a point or by just improving by putting the challenge down. So, London's population grew rapidly, as you can see through most of this graph, for decades, okay? Starting in 1881 all the way up to 1941, we are seeing an increase in London's population. We said it peaks in 1941, just before World War II, and it declined until the 1990s, which we see over here, when it started to grow rapidly again. And this, on any line graph like this, the steepness of the line tells us about the rate, how quickly that number is growing. Now, if we want to look for reasons for this, okay, we're going to say that over this entire period of time, London grew as it became wealthy, industrialized, attracted people from across the country and across the world. So there's lots of reasons that have contributed to this huge growth. Why did it decline though? What can we say about that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One of the reasons that it would have declined is that World War II brought with it the Blitz, and the Blitz was a bombing campaign that focused quite heavily on London, not just London, but a lot of focus on London, caused huge amounts of damage, and of course, a lot of people chose no longer to live in the city. In addition to that, the deindustrialization, which we have previously discussed with reference to particularly the North losing out from deindustrialization, and a lot of northern towns like Liverpool and Birmingham losing out from deindustrialization. Well, London wasn't immune from that. London still lost out from deindustrialization as well, particularly in the east of London. So between deindustrialization and the Blitz, there's a large decline in the number of people who want to live in the city. They choose to move out of the city. And we call this process where people choose to leave cities counter-urbanization. Then in the 1990s, the government and firms started to really pump lots of money and investment back into London's structures, in improving areas, even somewhere sort of central and vibrant today as Covent Garden was actually not very nice back in the 1970s and 80s. So this increase in number of people who want to live in London, who are choosing to live in London, is partly as a result of this regeneration, which started really in the late 1980s, but really had an impact on the population growth through the 1990s and early 2000s. So, we've talked about London's population overall, in terms of its total size. And now we're going to have a little look at the population pyramid of London. So this shows us sort of age gaps between different people in London. Where do we have the largest number of different age groups? Where do we have less of them? And also any differences that we might notice between male and female. Now, you have seen this pyramid before. This pyramid was part of your homework a few lessons ago. I just want to have another very quick look at it and see where do we notice a significant bulge or increase in the population. And hopefully you have spotted it down here in being able to say, actually, that a large number of people from the age of 20 to sort of 50 are living in London. Why is there this big bulge here? Of course, that is because that is our working age population. And why is there a bulge here? Well, because there are lots of jobs and opportunities, as we've mentioned. There's lots of people who choose to come to London during this sort of period in their lives to live here. Perhaps we can explain away this smaller number of older people by the fact that, maybe you move out of London and live somewhere quieter, maybe nicer, better quality of life, nicer environment. When you're older, maybe you've earned your money, you want to retire. So in terms of this question up here, where do we see fewer people than expected? Perhaps actually considering the UK's good record on health overall, we would expect to see a lot more old people. The UK's overall population pyramid is nowhere near this steep in the older ages. And of course then, migrants are often young people. So how does this explain another feature of the population pyramid? Well, we said there's this bulge of young people who might include lots of migrants. Why do we see a high number of young children then, 0 to 4? Well, of course, many of these people who are in their working age category are also becoming parents or bringing up children. And so a lot of people who first become parents might stay in London. Some of them might stay in London and bring their children up here. Some of them might have kids and then think, no, we want to go and live in the countryside. We want the air to be cleaner. We want a bit more space to bring up our kids. We want them to be able to run around outside. So there might be lots of reasons for that. But we do see that there are more young children in London than there are sort of in school years. So working age group make up the largest population of people in London, and this is largely due to migration. So a word that's come up quite a lot already in this lesson is migration, and it is a huge part of London's identity, its population, the characteristics of different areas. So let's think now about why people choose to migrate. I would like you to think about push factors, things that get people to leave where they currently live, and pull factors, things that draw people into a city. And looking at these following options, I'd like you to sort them into whether or not they're push factors, things that make you want to leave somewhere, or pull factors, things that make you want to come and go to a particular place, things that pull you in, okay? If we were wondering, for instance, about bright lights, what does that mean? That's sort of the buzz of the city. Anytime somebody says to you, oh, I wish I could live in New York, yeah? The excitement and thought of living in New York, all these famous people, all of these big, companies and businesses, these famous places, the excitement, call the bright lights of the big city. Okay, and as I hope you've understood from that explanation, it's something that draws people in. It is, of course, a pull factor. Okay, it's going to go in this column. Pause the video, put them in the right order for me, please. Off you go. Okay, let's have a look at some answers. So, push factors, natural disasters, no reason to stay, let's get out of there, it's dangerous. Unemployment, okay, very, very significant one, and links back to our key term right at the beginning of the lesson. We're talking about economic migrants, people that move because they want the opportunity of a better standard of living. Well, if there's high unemployment where you are, you want to get out of there. You want to go somewhere where you have higher opportunities of being employed. Lack of access to healthcare. It might be the case that you have a very specific disease, need specific care, or it might be a very general sense that you don't have access to healthcare. You might want to live somewhere that does. A decline in agriculture. A decline in agriculture is something we've talked about in previous lessons. We talked about the changing structure of the UK, particularly through that period of industrialisation. The number of people who work in agriculture has gone down. Now that means that a lot of people who are living in those rural areas and working in those areas too have now got issues with not just the decline in agriculture, but it leads to issues of unemployment. Mechanisation is part of the reason behind this decline in agriculture, but not just agriculture, other things too. A lot of skilled tasks have been taken over by machines. Even things like baking. Well, if you go and buy a loaf of Hovis from the supermarket, no human hand has touched that. That loaf of bread was made and packaged by a machine. It isn't a traditional baker that's doing that. So mechanisation can also lead to unemployment in all kinds of different ways, not just in agriculture. Discrimination may be a really significant social pushing factor that is going to encourage you to leave where you live. And in fact, we even find that some people become refugees on the basis of the strong discrimination, whether that's religious or sexual discrimination or that they have experienced. And of course, perhaps the more obvious, war and conflict, something that really forces you to leave where you live and go elsewhere. So the rest of them were pull factors then. Bright lights, we discussed that already. Access to education, wanting to have the opportunity to go to the right school or the best universities might draw you into any city. But of course, as we've mentioned, London has lots and lots of world-class institutions in terms of universities. So that's quite a big one for a lot of people moving to London. Of course, the opposite of unemployment is going to be employment opportunities. Where there are plenty of opportunities, people will go there. Industrialization might have been something that is linked to the decline in agriculture, and it draws people into cities. Now, all of the things that I've got on this table so far are not just about London. These are migration push and pull factors from pretty much any city you could discuss. You just have to be very specific about which ones of them affect London. So for example, when we talked about specialized industries, we've talked about the financial industry, we might talk about technology industries being based in London, those sorts of industries that have very, very specific functions that maybe you wouldn't be able to do elsewhere in the country. So, continuing with this theme that migration has impacted London a huge amount, I have a few short paragraphs for you. I'd like you to read it for me, please. And when you've read this little introduction to migration to London, I'd like you to highlight 3 facts that you think shows London's characteristics. Okay, what does it tell us about London and migration and how migration has influenced it? Because this is not just a recent thing. This is not just, Black and Asian people arriving in the 1960s and 50s. It actually goes all the way back to sort of the Roman period. We've had a long history of migration in London. So have a little read and see which 3 facts you might choose to highlight. So there are no real right or wrong answers here, but a couple of things that you might have chosen could be the number of languages spoken in London, more than any other city in the world. It's one of our most ethnically diverse cities in the world, over 300 languages and dialects in our schools alone. Okay, that's one way of measuring it because, of course, the school collects what languages we record, what languages people speak. It's also the most diverse area of England and Wales together. Okay, fewer than half of Londoners, 45% or 3.7 million people, are from the white British ethnic group. Now, that doesn't mean that London is majority migrants, but that will include people of colour who are the descendants of migrants. So if your grandparents arrived in the UK many years ago, and as an Asian person you live in London, still you get counted as not being from this white British ethnic group, even though you are still British. You may be British Indian or British African. So compared with the rest of the UK, this is really, really low. Across the rest of the UK, the vast majority of people are actually white British ethnically, okay? Whereas in London, less than half of the people living here are actually from that white British ethnic group. We've got a bit more detail down here about Brent specifically, because that's where we live in Wembley. And actually, Brent has amongst the highest diversity of people in London, despite the fact that London has one of the highest diversities of anywhere in the world. So really, really, really extreme example. Okay. And then an interesting example down here of unaccompanied child refugees. So another short article for you to read. This time, I'm not asking you, please, to highlight, but instead I want you to answer these 2 questions. So take a minute to read through the extract, please. It is from a newspaper, which was The Guardian. Okay, it's a little bit of an old article, but it gives us a bit of a flavour of comparing London to the rest of the country or places in the rest of the country. Still thinking about that theme of diversity. And of course, we've said that that is a product of high levels of migration. London is not the only diverse place in the UK, of course. Okay, but it is probably the most diverse place. Okay, and we can break London down into smaller districts. And if we were to look down here, we see the London Borough of Brent was the most diverse at the time of the census in 2001. Yes, this data is a little bit old. The data from 2011 is still being analysed. We're going to get up to, hopefully soon, 2021, we'll be getting some new data as well. So sometimes, yeah, we are using slightly out of date data when we look at census stuff. So first question, define the word homogeneous. Is up here in this paragraph. What does this word homogeneous mean? So if we're saying an analysis of neighbourhoods areas shows the most homogeneously white British communities are in Tony Blair's constituency in Sedgefield, which is not in London, by the way. The word homogeneous means for things to be everything the same, okay? In this context, in this example, it means that that community has a low level of ethnic diversity and the vast majority of people are white British. Notice about the areas that are most diverse. What place names can we see in this article? What do they all have in common, these places? Birmingham, Slough, Leicester, Luton, 24 London boroughs, Manchester, Wolverhampton, Oxford, Blackburn, Bradford. Anybody notice? They are, of course, all cities, okay? All of the most diverse places in this data are urban areas. Okay, so if we're comparing different places in the UK, which is what this entire unit is really about, okay, high diversity exists in cities, as well as, of course, most of the UK's population anyway. But still, very few minorities live in rural areas. Okay, and maybe you've experienced that yourself, having visited a rural area or not. Okay, maybe you live in a rural area. So, 24 London boroughs, we've mentioned Brent already, but other places such as Leicester or Bradford are well known for their large communities of ethnic minorities. So, for instance, Bradford and Leicester are well known for their large Asian, Indian and Pakistani specifically communities. Okay, we are moving on to our almost last task. Okay, so where do people go when people migrate to London? They tend to choose to live in particular locations, and this can create little clusters of people. Okay, if you think about the stereotypes of where different people live, it's not necessarily fair because people will be spread out, but there are clusters, there are specific high streets. I know if I want to find a specific food type, do I know which high street I would go to get that food type? Because there's actually a lot of demand for that ethnic food in that area. So what factors might affect where people live? What would make you choose to live in one place or another, okay, if you were a new migrant to London? What could persuade you to live there? Take a moment to think about it. Pop a couple of ideas down on your worksheet, please. So maybe you came up with the people you know, your friends, your family, or people that just speak the same language as you. Perhaps it's based on where you landed or started. Okay, there could be loads of different answers to this, and it really depends on where you've come from. So you might think that if we're talking about internal migration, people that move from other places in the UK, looking maybe for work and opportunities, they're going to choose to live in areas that have those work and opportunities. Maybe if you come in without having a job yet, you need to go and live somewhere that has lower rents. Or perhaps if you're moving for something like education, as a university graduate, you might move to London in search of employment after university, or you might move to London and live in a cheap area because you are a student, you don't have a high income, and you are studying in one of our London universities. If you've come from outside the UK then, all kinds of reasons why you might come, okay? You might be a highly skilled worker that a London firm needs to hire and is encouraging you to come. They often take up, our migrants to London, take up well-paid jobs in the knowledge economy like the city. But not everyone is doing those jobs. Sometimes it attracts people who are unskilled is a word that we often use. It's not a nice word perhaps, okay, but workers who are doing things that are not based on the knowledge economy, and these are particularly people doing jobs that UK workers don't always want, okay? If you want to be a refuse or bin collector, sometimes things like childcare, or cleaners, these people that are willing to take those jobs despite the relatively low pay, relatively low skill required that UK workers don't often want to do, they do often get taken by external migrants. And of course, why might you come to London if you were a university student? Well, London universities attract lots and lots of people from around the world. Right, guys, that is the end of lesson 5. I want you please to make sure before next lesson you complete the comparison table for Newham and Richmond. It requires bullet points in the right headings and the right spaces, okay? It doesn't need loads and loads of detail. I've given you everything you need. There's a little bit of data there. There are a couple of questions in the table. You put bullet points down. Make sure you've done that reading and preparation work for next lesson, please. Have a wonderful rest of the day. I'll see you later.